A gift for George. George really wanted a new toy. His favorite dinosaur had broken, and the boy was sad all day long. Mummy Pig decided to cheer up her son and took him to a new toy store on the outskirts of town. The store was strange. Dim lighting, creaky shelves, and the shopkeeper, an elderly pig with cloudy eyes, spoke very quietly, almost in a whisper. "Choose any toy, dear," said Mummy Pig. George wandered between the shelves, looking at bright toys, but his gaze was drawn to one special figure in the far corner, a small creature with big dark eyes and a wide smile. The tag read Laboo. "I want this one," said George, pointing at the toy. The shopkeeper looked strangely at the boy, then at Mummy Pig. "Are you sure? This toy is special. It requires special care." "What do you mean?" asked Mummy Pig. "Nothing special, just be attentive to the child's behavior." Mummy Pig shrugged and bought Laboo. George was delighted. He hugged the toy to himself all the way home, and Laboo seemed to look directly at him with her motionless eyes. At home, George immediately ran to his room to play with the new toy. He sat Laboo on the bed and began telling her about his favorite games. "You'll be my best friend," said George. And then it seemed to him that Laboo nodded slightly. The first few days everything was normal. George played with Laboo, carried her everywhere, even slept, hugging her. But gradually his behavior began to change. First, George became very quiet. He stopped running around the house, shouting and laughing. Instead, he sat for hours in his room, quietly talking to Laboo. "Who are you talking to in there?" asked Peppa, peeking in on her brother. "With Laboo. She tells me interesting stories." "But it's just a toy, George." "No, she's real. She talks to me." Peppa looked at the toy. Laboo sat on the bed with the same wide smile, but something about her pose seemed wrong to Peppa, as if the toy was watching her. Then George began saying strange things. He told his parents about a dark forest where Laboo lived, about other children who played there forever. He said that Laboo showed him this world in dreams. "I like it there," George said with a distant look. "It's always dark and quiet there. And no one shouts." His parents became worried. George began avoiding sunlight, preferring to sit in dark corners. He stopped eating his favorite food and barely slept at night. One night, Mummy Pig heard George talking in his room. She quietly approached the door and listened. "Yes, Laboo, I understand. I want to stay with you forever. Your world is much better." Mummy Pig entered the room. George sat on the bed holding Laboo in his hands. His eyes were wide open, but his gaze was empty, as if he was looking through his mother. "George, who are you talking to?" "With Laboo. She says she'll take me to her place soon. We'll play in her world where it's always night." Mummy Pig felt a chill. She took Laboo from her son's hands. The toy was ice cold, even though George had been holding it in his warm hands. "I think you need to rest from this toy for a while," said Mummy, and took Laboo to another room. George screamed like never before. He cried and begged to return Laboo, said he couldn't live without her. At night, Mummy Pig woke up to a strange sound, quiet footsteps in the corridor. She left the bedroom and saw George walking toward the room where Laboo lay. The boy moved strangely, like a sleepwalker. His eyes were closed. "George!" called Mummy, but the boy didn't react. He reached the room, took Laboo, and returned to his room. In the morning, he didn't remember how it happened. The parents decided to get rid of the toy. They took Laboo back to the store, but the shopkeeper only smiled mysteriously. "She'll return," he said. "They always return to their children." And indeed, the next day, Laboo was back in George's room. No one knew how she got there. Each day, George became more distant. He almost stopped talking to his family, spending all his time with Laboo. His skin became pale, and his eyes lost their shine. One morning, the parents went into George's room to wake him up, but the bed was empty. Only Laboo lay on the pillow with her unchanging smile. George was nowhere to be found. The search continued for weeks, but the boy seemed to have vanished into thin air, and Laboo remained in the house, waiting for the next child who would want to play with her. Night fell over Peppa Pig's house. It all began ordinarily, dinner, casual conversation, but something hung in the air. Peppa felt her parents were acting differently. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig sat at the table too quietly. Their eyes reflected the light of the lamp, but inside there was nothing, like two glass orbs, no emotions, no warmth. Peppa pushed her plate away, a lump stuck in her throat. George, usually restless, sat silently, clutching his dinosaur tightly. The silence at the table was so heavy that the ticking of the hallway clock sounded like hammer strikes. Later, deep in the night, Peppa woke to a strange sound. Something rustled dully in the corridor. She woke George, and together, they cautiously left their room. There was no moonlight, only a faint flicker of a lamp from the living room. They came closer and peeked through the crack in the door, and froze. Mummy and Daddy Pig stood in the middle of the room, motionless, like statues. Their bodies swayed slightly, as if held by invisible strings. Their eyes were completely black, without a glimmer, and their smiles stretched from ear to ear. "Go back to bed," came Daddy Pig's voice. But it sounded hollow, like an echo in a cave. It was his voice, and at the same time, not his. The children stumbled back and ran to their room. Peppa hid under the blanket and couldn't sleep for a long time. It seemed like the shadows on the walls were moving on their own. The morning only made things worse. At breakfast, Daddy Pig smiled too wide, showing sharp teeth that had never been there before. Mummy moved around the kitchen with unnerving grace, her steps too smooth, too perfect, like a rehearsal of a dance. Peppa glanced at George, but he only shook his head. He was scared. At that moment, something shifted outside the window. First, a shadow, enormous, covering half the yard. Then a heavy step that made the dishes on the table rattle. And then Peppa saw him, Bombardiro Crocodilo, but not the one she once knew. His eyes glowed scarlet, his jaws slightly open, and every tooth shone like a blade. His massive body moved slowly, but each step echoed deep through the ground. He drew closer to the house, and with every lash of his tail, the walls trembled. Peppa shrank back from the window in horror. Mummy and Daddy didn't react. They continued their movements, as if programmed. Suddenly, a voice rang out. Not from her parents, not from outside. It sounded directly inside Peppa's head, low and crushing. "You're watching this. Press the hype button below the video before it's too late." Peppa gasped in terror. It felt like those words weren't meant only for her, as if Bombardiro Crocodilo himself was speaking to someone else, watching alongside her. She grabbed George's hand, and they ran into the corridor. But it was darker than usual. Doors that had never existed appeared along the walls. From each came whispers and rasping breaths. Bulbs flickered and went out one by one. From the living room came a scraping sound. The children froze. Suddenly, Mummy Pig stepped into the corridor. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her smile was far too wide, her eyes completely empty. Behind her appeared Daddy. They walked in sync, without hesitation. "Children must obey," they said together in one voice. Peppa and George rushed to the front door, but Bombardiro's silhouette was already outside the glass. His shadow blocked out all the light. His breathing rumbled like a volcano. He tilted his head, and his scarlet eyes blazed even brighter. "We are waiting!" his voice thundered. The door swung open on its own, and a cold wind swept inside. But it wasn't the wind, it was the breath of the crocodilo. It dragged darkness behind it, filling the entire corridor. Peppa screamed, but the sound drowned in the roar. George cowered behind her, his hands shaking. Mummy and Daddy stepped closer, their bodies distorted, merging with the shadows. They no longer seemed to belong to the world of the living. Bombardiro raised his claw and struck the ground. The house shuddered. Windows cracked. The chandelier swayed. He took another step forward, and at that moment, everything around began to warp. Rooms vanished, walls stretched and collapsed, turning into an endless corridor. Peppa clutched her brother and shut her eyes. But even through her eyelids, she saw the red glow of his eyes. The last thing she heard was the sound of a broken melody, like the beat of a heart, and a deep, triumphant growl. "Now you are mine." And the night swallowed everything. The Laboo toy Peppa found a strange toy in an old chest in the attic. A small figure with big, dark eyes and a wide smile. It had a tag, Laboo. The toy was soft but cold to the touch, as if it had been kept in a freezer for a long time. "Can I take it to my room?" Peppa asked Mummy Pig. "Of course, dear. But wash it first, it's very dusty." Peppa took Laboo to her room and placed it on the shelf next to her other toys. The toy stared straight ahead with an unmoving gaze. Something about its smile seemed wrong, too wide for such a small face. At night, Peppa woke up to a strange sound, quiet rustling, as if someone was crawling on the floor. She turned on the nightlight and looked around the room. Everything was in its place, but Laboo had disappeared from the shelf. "Where is it?" Peppa muttered, getting out of bed. She found the toy under the bed, lying on its side. Strange! How could it have gotten there? Peppa picked up Laboo and put it back on the shelf. The toy seemed heavier than before, and its smile had become even wider. The next day, Peppa was playing with George in the living room. Suddenly, she heard the patter of little feet upstairs. "Mummy, someone's walking in my room," Peppa said. "There's no one there, dear. Maybe it's mice." But when Peppa went up to her room, Laboo was not on the shelf again. This time, it was standing in the middle of the room, turned toward the door. Its pose was as if it had been waiting for Peppa. "How did you get here?" Peppa whispered, carefully approaching the toy. Laboo was silent, but its eyes seemed to follow Peppa's every movement. The girl quickly grabbed the toy and put it back on the shelf, but this time turned it to face the wall. At night, the rustling repeated, but now it was louder. Peppa woke up and saw that Laboo was standing by her bed, looking straight at her. In the darkness, its eyes glowed with a faint greenish light. "What do you want from me?" Peppa whispered, not daring to move. The toy didn't answer, but slowly raised one hand, as if it wanted to touch Peppa. The girl screamed and turned on the light. Laboo instantly became an ordinary toy lying on the floor. "Mummy! Daddy! What happened?" asked Mummy Pig, running into the room. "Laboo! It was moving! It was standing by my bed! It's just a toy, dear. It can't move." But Peppa saw the truth in Laboo's dark eyes. The next day, she tried to throw the toy away, but it kept returning to her room. First in the trash can, then in the garden, even when Peppa took it to the neighbors. Laboo always found its way back. It began appearing in the most unexpected places. In Peppa's school bag, in the refrigerator, even in the bathroom. Each time its smile became wider and its eyes brighter. One night, Peppa woke up and found that all her toys had lined up in a row, looking at the bed. And in the center stood Laboo, like a commander of an army. "Now you understand," whispered a voice that seemed to come from all the toys at once. "I'm not just a toy, I'm a collector. And now you're part of my collection." Peppa wanted to scream but couldn't move. Her body was becoming stiffer, like a toy. She felt her skin turning to plastic and her thoughts slowing down. "Don't worry," said Laboo, coming closer. "Being a toy isn't so bad. You'll play forever. With me." In the morning, Mummy Pig found a new toy in Peppa's room, very similar to her daughter. It stood on the shelf next to Laboo, with the same wide smile and motionless gaze. "Strange, I don't remember buying this toy," Mummy Pig muttered, adjusting the little dress of the toy Peppa, and Laboo stood nearby, its smile even wider. Now it had a friend, forever. But Laboo's collection wasn't complete yet. In the evening, it heard George playing in the next room. It was time to find a new friend. An ordinary evening in Peppa Pig's house. Rain drummed on the roof, the wind pushed heavy clouds across the sky, and inside there was that same cozy silence that usually brought comfort. The family gathered in the living room. Daddy Pig leafed through his newspaper, Mummy Pig was knitting, George played with his dinosaur, and Peppa was building a tower of blocks. Everything looked normal, but Peppa couldn't shake off a strange sense of unease. She noticed it first. The light in the room flickered, the lamp dimmed for a moment, and the shadows on the walls stirred. At first, it seemed like nothing more than the wind and the storm outside. But a minute later, the shadows changed again. They stretched longer than they should have and began to move on their own, no longer tied to the people in the room. "Something's wrong with the lamp," muttered Daddy Pig, getting up and fiddling with the switch. But the light burned steadily. Only the shadows moved freely. They twisted, intertwined, and became more and more distorted. Shapes appeared on the walls that shouldn't exist. Crooked arms with unnaturally long fingers, twisted faces, grimacing mouths. "Mummy," whispered Peppa. "It's fine, darling," Mummy Pig quickly replied, but her voice trembled and her hands shook so badly that the knitting slipped from her lap. George whimpered, clutching his dinosaur to his chest. Even his toy cast a shadow that twitched oddly, moving differently than the dinosaur itself, as if alive. The clock on the wall ticked louder and louder, and each tick thudded like a chill in Peppa's chest. The shadows kept growing, stretching toward the ceiling, the floor, the children. And then one of them separated. It swelled larger than the rest, filling half the room. Its shape was uneven, like smoke given form. Two red points flared where its eyes should be. The figure leaned forward, and from its mouth came a deep, drawn-out growl. "Daddy!" whispered Peppa. But Daddy Pig didn't move. His eyes were wide, his lips trembling, yet no words came. Mummy Pig gripped the armrests of her chair so tightly that her knuckles went white. The creature advanced, its clawed arms stretched toward Peppa, reaching closer and closer. She tried to scream, but her voice was gone. Her heart pounded so hard it drowned out everything else. And then something stirred on the shelf. Laboo. His glass eyes lit up red. The toy that had always sat motionless suddenly came alive. Slowly, he jumped down. His tiny feet touched the floor softly, yet the sound echoed as if he were far heavier than he looked. He stood directly in front of Peppa. His smile widened, twisted, almost monstrous. The creature froze, its red eyes locked with Laboo's. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the rain against the windows. Then, from Laboo's little hands, a stream of thick black energy burst forth. It surged toward the shadow creature, colliding with it like lightning. The air trembled, filled with the smell of damp earth and burning at once. The creature hissed, its body jerking violently, tearing apart piece by piece. It reached toward Laboo with its claws, but he only lifted his gaze, and his glowing eyes flared so brightly that Peppa flinched, nearly blinded. A piercing scream rang out, so sharp it rattled her ears. The shadow writhed as if being ripped apart, and with a final hiss dissolved into nothing. The family sat in stunned silence. George no longer cried. He only clutched his dinosaur tightly, his eyes wide with terror. Mummy and Daddy Pig sat pale and shaken. unable to comprehend what they had seen. Laboo stood on the floor, his glowing red eyes slowly dimmed. His smile softened, turned back into its familiar, innocent curve. He looked once more like an ordinary toy, but Peppa knew he wasn't. She stared at him, feeling deep down that he hadn't just saved them. He had enjoyed it. His smile, even when gentle again, no longer looked harmless. The shadows on the walls never completely disappeared. They still writhed faintly, but quieter now, calmer, almost as if obeying something. Peppa turned to Laboo. He was already back on the shelf. His head was tilted slightly, his eyes faintly glimmering in the darkness, following the movements of every remaining shadow. And his smile widened just a little more. Peppa hugged George tightly and realized this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. Peppa woke up in complete darkness. No sound, no glimmer of light, as if the world had vanished. She looked around, but George wasn't there. The house was silent, and even the walls felt unfamiliar. Peppa's hoof touched George's toy dinosaur on the floor, but George himself seemed to have dissolved into nothing. The window, which usually opened onto the garden and street, now showed only a black void, dense and bottomless. She carefully approached the door. The floorboards creaked too loudly, though she could usually walk without a sound. Her heart pounded, her breath grew unsteady. When she stepped into the hallway, it felt as if something in the dark was watching her. The walls seemed alive. Strange shadows rippled across their surface, shadows that shouldn't have been there. "George!" Peppa called, but the only reply was her own voice echoing back at her, as if the house had too many empty rooms. She took a few steps toward the stairs, and just then, the lamp above her flickered. Light flared, then instantly died. But in that moment, Peppa saw a figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. Tall, distorted, as though stretched out of the darkness. Its eyes glowed red, and from its mouth came a strange, low sound, an echoing, broken melody. "Tongue! Tongue! Saha!" the figure hissed. Peppa froze. Her legs felt rooted to the floor. Her heart stopped. Her mouth went dry. The creature lifted its hand and stepped forward. The floor groaned beneath it, but the footsteps sounded as if they came from several places at once. Peppa instinctively closed her eyes and pressed her ears with her hooves, but the melody only grew louder. She could hear it inside her head now, along with a whisper. "You're watching this, aren't you? Press the HYPE button below the video, or he'll come for you too." Peppa opened her eyes and screamed. The creature was closer now. Its movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Its face was too long, its mouth stretched too wide, and its eyes burned brighter and brighter red. She backed away, but the hallway grew longer. Each step didn't bring her closer to her room, but instead dragged her deeper into the house. Doors on either side opened on their own, and from each came the same whisper. "Tongue, tongue, Saha." Peppa ran to her parents' room and pushed the door open, desperate for safety. But the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, belongings carefully placed, as if her parents had never lived there. On the wall mirror, she saw not herself, but George. He stood motionless, his eyes hollow, his mouth moving, repeating the creature's words. Peppa stumbled back in horror. The mirror cracked, and George from the reflection stepped forward, trying to emerge. The girl screamed and bolted into the hall. Lights flickered everywhere, and each time they lit, the silhouette of Tung Tung Sahur appeared. Sometimes ahead of her, sometimes behind, sometimes right beside her. She burst into the living room. The television switched on by itself, showing only static, and from the speakers came the same melody. On the screen flashed her own face, twisted, foreign. Its lips moved, and it spoke. "You cannot escape." Peppa clamped her hooves over her ears, shut her eyes, pressed against the wall. But the sound only grew stronger. The air thickened around her, and every shadow in the room began to shift, stretching toward the center. The creature slowly emerged from the darkness. Its hands reached for Peppa, fingers too long, bent like hooks. It tilted its head, and its mouth split into a grin filled with alien, inhuman joy. "Tonight will not end," Tung Tung Sahur intoned. His voice echoed from the TV, from the mirror, from the shadows themselves. Peppa screamed, but her voice drowned in the roaring melody. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The world quaked around her, walls pulling apart and closing again, the ceiling rising higher, turning the house into an endless maze. The last thing she saw were the creature's burning red eyes. They loomed closer and closer until they filled her vision completely. And then came darkness, silence, and a whisper, faint but clear. "She's ours now.